Senator Paterson.
Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. And can I begin by thanking Senator Hanson and One Nation for raising this issue in the chamber and for their public advocacy about this issue, because I absolutely share their concerns, both about the remuneration received by the CEO of Australia Post, but even more importantly, in many ways, the way in which Australia Post tried to conceal that information from the public and prevent exactly this sort of debate from occurring in the chamber and in the community. I should start with two quick relevant declarations. Senators may be aware that their former colleague and my predecessor, the much-beloved Michael Rawlinson, was recently appointed to the board of Australia Post, although this is not something that I've canvassed with him. And I'm lucky enough to have been lucky enough to chair the relevant committee, the Senate Standing Committee, the Legislation Committee on Environment and Communications. Although I can share with the Senate that unfortunately I will no longer be chairing this committee as I'm going on to other things, but I'll come to that in a moment. As senators would be aware, in the last round of Senate estimates, Senators Urquhart and Senators Astiari asked a series of questions to the CEO of Australia Post about the executive remuneration policies at Australia Post. Now, in my view, it shouldn't have been necessary for them to ask these questions, because the standard practice at Australia Post in the past has been to publish in their annual report this information. But Australia Post recently ceased to publish that information, and for reasons of which I will come to in a moment. So it was necessary for Senators Urquhart and Astiari to question them on this. At Senate estimates, the CEO took the questions on notice and wasn't able to provide the answers immediately, and undertook to get back to the Senate with his answers. Australia Post took the full amount of time available through the estimates process before they replied to the committee, which is their right, but I note that I suspect that it would have been easy and quick for them to find this information. I don't think it would have taken much digging for them to find this information. And when they did decide to provide the information to the committee, they did so on the basis that they requested that it was only given to us confidentially. Now, this is a deeply concerning thing, which I spoke about in the Senate last week when we tabled this information first in the Senate. It's disturbing for a number of reasons. Firstly, as all senators are aware, Senate estimates is required to be conducted entirely in public. It is not permissible for the Senate to receive information during estimates that is not public. Secondly, it is also up to the Senate committee itself to determine whether, in normal circumstances, a witness can provide information on a confidential basis. It is for the Senate committee to invite the witness to provide it on a confidential basis. It is not for a witness to take it upon themselves to provide it on a confidential basis, and yet that is what Australia Post did. The committee, through me and the Secretariat, engaged in an exchange of letters over a number of months with Australia Post to ask them to substantiate their claim that it was necessary that this information not be public. I have to say I was disappointed with the sorts of reasons that Australia Post provided to the committee, and that was one of the reasons why the committee saw fit to release all the correspondence and the information provided by Australia Post last week in the Senate. Among the reasons that Australia Post requested that the information remain confidential was that it could potentially damage the organisation in a commercial sense, that it could breach the privacy of the individuals involved, and it could damage the reputations of the individuals involved. They also asked the committee, if we were to decide to release the information, to give them a grace period of about a week before we release the information, to allow them to prepare some stakeholder management before it was to become public and obviously an item of interest in the media. This was something which was also of great concern to the committee. It is not an option for the committee, once it has decided to receive information and to publish it, to withhold publishing it for the convenience of an organisation which is obliged to provide that information in public in the first place. We have seen, I suppose, in the media coverage over the last week why Australia Post was reluctant to have this information in public and why they wanted time to manage their response. But just because there is tough public scrutiny of the expenditure of public money does not mean that it is acceptable for the Senate to participate in shielding that information from the Australian public. So I'm personally very glad that this information is public, and I'm glad we've had the debate that we've had over the last week about it. My view is that it is the role of a board of an organisation to set the remuneration policies for that organisation, including a government business enterprise. But they should do so mindful of the fact that they are a government business enterprise, that they are wholly owned by Australian taxpayers, that over its many, many decades of history it has received substantial assistance from taxpayers, particularly in the form of monopoly protection from competition, and that it is inextricably, its current profitability and its current performance is inextricably linked to the taxpayer support it has received over its history. So to argue, as Australia Post did, that in some way they should not be required to make this information public because Australia Post has made disbursements to the government and has been a source of revenue for the government in recent years, was another concerning aspect of our interaction with Australia Post. The very fact that taxpayers do receive money from Australia Post, and it is a significant sum of money, is one of the reasons why we're entitled to take interest in this matter. On the merits of the remuneration of the CEO in particular, I agree with comments made by the Prime Minister and many others that it is excessive, and I think any fair assessment of the facts looking internationally demonstrates, and in Australia demonstrates, that it's excessive. Many people in this debate have focused on the salaries received by comparable post organisations around the world. Many senators would have heard Canada Post pays their chief executive about $500,000 Australian, the US Postal Service a little bit more than $500,000 Australian, the French Postal Service $634,000 Australian, and the privatised UK Royal Mail pays their chief executive $2.5 million, all substantially less than Australia Post's as an organisation, even though these are comparable in size and scale and complexity. But actually I'm very interested in comparing it to the private sector alternatives, because some of the arguments made in the media by people advocating on behalf of Australia Post in recent weeks have concentrated on the fact that the CEO of Australia Post could command a very good salary in the private sector, and I don't doubt that for a moment. But it's instructive to look at organisations of similar complexity and size, but which are much, much more profitable than Australia Post, and how much they pay their CEOs. And the three comparisons I have particularly in mind are three of the major banks: the ANZ, the National Australia Bank and Westpac. Each of these organisations pays a similar amount of remuneration to their CEOs in most recent financial years, ranging from just a little bit over $5 million at ANZ to just a little bit less than $7 million at Westpac. And so they're in the same ballpark as the CEO of Australia Post. And yet these organisations have revenue many, many, many more times higher than Australia Post, have more employees than Australia Post, and certainly are far more profitable than Australia Post. In the case of ANZ, its revenue is $21 billion. In the case of NAB, its revenue is $20 billion. In the case of Westpac, it's $22 billion, compared to $6.6 billion for Australia Post. And these organisations all posted very healthy multi-billion-dollar profits that were returned to their shareholders, in contrast to the very slim profits provided by Australia Post. Now, I appreciate that Australia Post is operating in a difficult and changing commercial environment, and I would not begrudge in any way a very generous remuneration package for the CEO of Australia Post. But I think the $5.6 million that the Australia Post board has decided was appropriate to pay the CEO is only the kind of decision a board would make if they knew that it would not be something that would be publicly scrutinised. I don't think any board member in their right mind would think it would be appropriate to pay a wage like that if they knew it was going to be subject to public scrutiny. Now, listed companies in Australia are legally required to reveal the remuneration packages of their senior executives, and I don't think we should expect any lesser standard from a government business enterprise. In fact, I think we should expect a higher standard, given the fact that taxpayers' money is involved. But listed companies are also, through the Corporations Act, subject to a vote by their shareholders. And if a remuneration package of the senior management is voted down twice at a listed company, then there is an automatic spill of the entire board of the organisation. Now, I'm not proposing that the federal government spill the board of Australia Post, certainly not now or any time soon, but I am asking the board of Australia Post at the upcoming Senate estimates to take their obligations very seriously and to disclose relevant information. Unfortunately, I won't be there as I'm moving to the Finance and Public Administration Committee, but I have every confidence in my colleagues in the Senate to do so.